Resuming debate, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Prime Minister, inflation has reached its highest level in 40 years. Work no longer pays. The cost of housing has doubled. Crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder are common on our streets, and the Prime Minister divides Canadians to distract from all of his failures. We must recognize the country that the Prime Minister found when he came into office. Let's begin with interest rates and inflation. Those rates were low. Taxes were going down faster than at any point in our country's history. The budget was balanced. Crime had gone down by 25%, so much so that people in small towns often left their door unlocked. Our borders were secure. Housing cost half of what it costs today. Net wages had gone up by 10%. That's after inflation and after taxes. The New York Times said that the Canadian middle class was richer. The New York Times said that the Canadian middle class was richer than the American middle class for the first time. All of that despite an unprecedented financial crisis in the United States and a war in Syria, in Iraq, and yes, in Ukraine. It's amusing to note that in Stephen Harper's day, those wars did not cause inflation in Canada. But when this current Prime Minister took power, prices went up exorbitantly. 8 years later, look at where we are. Inflation, after having already reached 40-year highs, is once again too high. The economy is contracting. The economy is not growing, even though the population is growing. GDP per capita today is lower than it was 6 years ago. It's the first time in our history that we've seen the economy and GDP per capita go down over 6 years. Canada's growth is the lowest in the OECD. Not only for the next 6 years, but for the next 3 decades. That's according to the OECD. That's not me. The cost of housing has more than doubled after 8 years of this government. After he promised to bring it down, it takes 25 years to save up enough money for a down payment in Toronto. Before this Prime Minister, it took 25 years to pay off a whole mortgage. Some families have to increase their mortgage to 80 years. That means that it could take 120 years to be able to not be in debt as a family. In reality, it will be children and grandchildren who will have to pay off mortgages from their parents and grandparents. We've never seen that in Canada. And I imagine there's nowhere in the world where that is the case.
Canadian homes now cost more than 50% more in Canada than in the United States. That's the reality after 8 years under this Prime Minister, who promised to make life more affordable. And what are his solutions today? First of all, he wants to increase taxes on gas, which increases the cost of everything. Everything that needs transportation will cost more with the carbon tax, which the government has just confirmed, which will increase the price of gas by 17 cents and 20 cents if we add to that the sales tax on it, a tax that the Bloc wants to increase on the backs of Quebecers. We're hearing promises for billions of dollars for housing, the same promises that we've heard for the past 8 years. For 8 years, we've heard about these expenditures, but it's only increasing bureaucracy and not housing. Another $20 billion in new spending, which will add to inflation and increasing interest rates. The Scotiabank has already said that 2% more percentage points of the interest rate are due to mortgages. And now, talking about the debt, next year, for the first time, we will spend more on debt interest than on health care. $50 trillion, $50 billion on debt. Then we send to the provinces for doctors and nurses. So bankers, investors in Manhattan will get the money, and our teachers, our nurses, our doctors won't get it. It makes no sense, Mr. Speaker. Fortunately, our plan is based on common sense. It will eliminate waste to reduce inflation and interest rates. We will eliminate taxes to increase the cost of living for every Canadian. We will reduce taxes so that people work and get a paycheck. We will rebuild the Canadian dream where work allows anyone, no matter where they are, to earn a good living, to have a house, and to live peacefully in their communities. So the choice at the next elections will be between a costly coalition, which will take money away from you, increase your taxes, increase income taxes, and allow more crime, or people can be guided by good sense, common sense, which will allow them to earn more money to buy food, gas, and buy a house in the communities in which they live, which are safe. That's the choice, and we will be the only choice that makes sense for Quebecers and all Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as we stand here today and witness the misery that is visible across this country, it's hard to forget how good things were only 8 years ago when this Prime Minister took office. Let me review the hard facts. Never before has a Prime Minister inherited a richer legacy. Inflation and interest rates were rock bottom. Taxes were falling faster than at any time in Canadian history. The budget was balanced. It took 25 years to pay off a mortgage, not just to get a mortgage. Crime had fallen by 25%, so low that many small-town folks actually left their doors unlocked. Remember those good days when you could leave your door unlocked? No one would do that today. Our borders were secure. Housing costs half what it does today. Take-home pay had gone up 10% after tax and inflation. The New York Times had calculated that Canada's middle class was, for the first time ever, richer than America's middle class. All this despite a once-in-a-lifetime financial crisis in the U.S. and wars in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and yes, Ukraine. Funny how those wars didn't cause inflation when Prime Minister Harper was leading our economy. But yes, it's true that when this Prime Minister took office, Canada was rich, affordable, and safe. 8 years ago, yes, it was. Rich, affordable, and safe. And it's true, the very wealthy had not done particularly well. In fact, their share of the economy had shrunk during the Harper years. Now, the wealth concentrates among the very, very rich. And that is because inflationary policies always help the richest people. When government concentrates wealth in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats, they give it to the most politically influential people, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And now we're seeing the biggest gap ever between rich and poor. And a middle class, he promised to help the middle class. He has demolished the middle class, Mr. Speaker. That is the reality. Inflation, after hitting 40-year highs, is back on the move. The economy is now shrinking. And if you add in per capita terms, it is plummeting, Mr. Speaker. In fact, GDP per person is actually smaller than it was 6 years ago. This has never happened, Mr. Speaker. Canada's growth is now projected to be the worst in the OECD between now and 2030, and the worst for the next 4 decades, according to the OECD. That's out of 40 countries. It now takes 25 years to save up for a down payment in Toronto. You used to pay off a mortgage in that time. Since this Prime Minister has taken office, families have stretched out the terms of their mortgages to 90 years. Today, the minister bragged that she's going to create this charter, which will, people are supposed to be grateful about this, will allow them to stretch out their mortgages longer. So that you can now have a 100-year mortgage. Wow, and now we're supposed to thank them. Wow, what a wonderful news. I imagine she'll send it out in the mail so people can open their mailbox and find out that their great-great-grandchildren will still be paying off the mortgage on their home. Canadian homes now cost 50% more than in the United States of America. In fact, you can now buy a 20-bedroom castle in Scotland for a lower price than a 2-bedroom in Kitchener. Vancouver is now the third most unaffordable housing market in the world when you compare median income to median house prices, worse than New York City, than Los Angeles, Chicago, London, England, even Singapore, a tiny island with 2,000 times more people per square kilometer than Canada, has more affordable housing. In Toronto is rated by UBS to be the worst housing bubble in the world. If we had even imagined to say such a thing out loud 8 years ago, people would have laughed. But today, it is the reality, and they're not laughing. They're actually crying. In fact, the government promises all of a sudden, after 8 years, we should believe in their multi-billion-dollar promises to build homes. They built fewer homes last year than were built in 1972, 50 years ago. And that was at a time when our population was half of what it is today. So we're building fewer homes now that we have 40 million people than we built when we had 22 million people, Mr. Speaker. And no wonder we have this new phenomenon of middle-class, working, homeless people. We've never seen this before, but now we have nurses, electricians, carpenters living in parking lots, something they couldn't even imagine in Halifax, in your province, Speaker. The province, ironically, of the housing minister. There are 30 homeless encampments in one city. This would have been unimaginable. And now they expect us to believe that this time they mean it, that their billions of dollars of new spending are going to change what the billions of dollars they've spent over the last decade have caused. And that is the worst housing crisis in Canadian history. That, adding more debt than all of the previous 22 prime ministers combined. He continually tells us that there are no consequences for that debt. Well, the consequences are now becoming clear. Next year, the government will spend more on debt interest than it does on health care. So instead of the money going to doctors and nurses, it will go to bankers and bondholders in Manhattan and in London, England. Another transfer of wealth from the working class to everybody else, to the wealthiest people, from the working class to the smirking class, Mr. Speaker. We see the social breakdown that this has brought in our communities, with crime raging out of control. Shootings are up 101% across Canada over the last 8 years. Drug overdoses, 30,000 of them, Mr. Speaker. social breakdown is the obvious consequence of the economic breakdown that the Prime Minister has caused. And on what has he spent all of this money? $54 million for the ArriveCan app that we didn't need, didn't work, and could have been done in a weekend by a couple of IT workers. We know that because they did. A couple of IT workers, as a lark, bought a few boxes of pizza and a case of beer and redesigned the entire ArriveCan app in a weekend. And it didn't cost them $54 million. Maybe we should send that app to the Prime Minister and call it the ResignCan app, Mr. Speaker. And then they blew $1 billion on a so-called green fund. The top bureaucrats say that who are involved in it say that it's a money-for-nothing scheme with gross incompetence that reminds them of the sponsorship scandal. The chair of the fund gave $200,000 of the money to her own company. Now, we find out that the $15 billion they're giving to a single battery plant is going to pay for 1,600 foreign workers. 1,600 foreign workers, Mr. Speaker. And they don't even have a place to live. There's a housing shortage in Windsor. Now, the Prime Minister's solution is to spend precious tax dollars on paychecks for people on the other side of the world to come here temporarily, collect the money, and take it back to South Korea. We all love South Korea, great country, but there's no reason why Canadian taxpayers should be subsidizing their paychecks. Yeah. Canadian tax dollars should exclusively go to Canadian paychecks. That's common sense. And the Prime Minister, of course, wastes money through missed opportunities. We could develop our resources. For example, we could be breaking dependence on the world's dictators. And let's talk about this for a moment. Today, his party shamefully voted to impose a carbon tax on the people of Ukraine. They have voted to amend the existing Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, which Conservatives negotiated and which has been a success, to require that both countries have and promote carbon taxes, Mr. Speaker. Exactly the opposite of what the people of Ukraine need. They don't need a carbon tax when they're trying to fight and defeat a war. They need the ability to rebuild their economy, which takes energy. And that's why Conservatives will oppose any imposition of a carbon tax there or here or anywhere around the world. And you know what else they did? They voted against an amendment that would allow Canadians to build the arms that would allow Ukraine to win that war. We proposed an amendment to this update of the agreement that would have allowed Ukrainians to benefit from our incredible Canadian workers who produce munitions and equipment, and they voted no. So let's get this straight. They believe that the best way to counter Putin is with a carbon tax. We believe the best way to do it is by breaking European dependence on his energy sector and by providing and selling great Canadian arms to win the war. Canadians understand that the way that you help a country rebuild is by selling technology for energy. We proposed as well that we would provide both civilian nuclear technology and sell our civilian-grade uranium from Saskatchewan to power nuclear plants that would give emissions-free electricity to Ukrainians as they have to replace bombed-out electricity plants. The Prime Minister did not include that in his deal because he doesn't want affordable energy. He doesn't want the jobs to come back to our resource sector. All he wanted was to try and save his carbon tax. That's just how desperate he is. And in fact, how sick he is on this matter, Mr. Speaker. We all know that he was desperate to save his carbon tax. But for him to use the people of Ukraine as a pawn in his scheme to save the carbon tax is a level of cynicism that we didn't even expect from that Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. When I'm Prime Minister, we will have a free trade agreement with Ukraine, and that agreement will not include a carbon tax. It will include the ability of us to provide clean Canadian nuclear and natural gas to have a strong energy superpower status for Canada and a superior Ukraine. And the hypocritical members over there who pretend they support Ukraine, but then they supported the Prime Minister signing off on a turbine to go from Montreal to Putin so that he could power his natural gas pipeline and pump that gas into Europe to fund his war. That's the Prime Minister's priority, to give Putin more money selling natural gas. Our priority, our common sense plan, turns dollars for dictators into paychecks for our people in this country. I don't think this debate is going how they expected it to go. Their heads are all looking down, and rightfully so, Mr. Speaker. It will be a good moment for them to atone for the cynical approach they've taken on this and everything else, and frankly, the misery that they have unleashed in this country. This is the worst time in Canada's history for the Canadian people, particularly for the middle class. But the good news is we have a common sense plan that will axe the tax to bring home lower prices, cap spending and cut waste to bring down inflation and interest rates, remove bureaucracy to build more homes so that once again people can afford to rent and pay their mortgages. This will be a country that works for the people who do the work, the common people, the common sense of the common people, united for our common home. Your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it on.
Eric.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Russia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our government's fall economic statement announces new measures in order to get more homes built faster. The leader of the Conservative Party has called that, and I quote, a disgusting scheme. Shameful. Mr. Speaker.
Terrible.
Why does the leader of the Conservative Party think that investments in the construction of 30,000 new rental apartments is disgusting? Why does the leader of the Conservative Party think that new federal investments for the construction of 7,000 new affordable homes is disgusting? Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Conservative Party owes us and Canadians an explanation.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, those houses cannot be characterized with any adjective other than non-existent. They don't exist. They stand up day after day and list off the thousands of houses that they have not built. Yeah. They've had 8 years. It would be one thing if they were still promising to build homes in their first year, maybe their second year. Okay, we'll give them 3 years. It has been 8 years. And the only thing they have accomplished on housing since promising to make it affordable is doubling the cost. They have doubled the rent, doubled mortgage payments, doubled the needed down payment for a home, and now we have $900 billion of mortgages that are coming up for renewal. That's 2/3 of all mortgages. And the IMF says we are the #1 at risk of having a mortgage crisis. It is disgusting to think of the families who did everything right, who risked losing everything because of the irresponsible policies of this Prime Minister and his NDP government.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, We often hear the Conservatives squabbling with the Liberals, but they're the same. In the economic update, the Liberals don't talk about homelessness, them either. They don't talk about small businesses and extending CEBA loans by a year. They won't talk about that either. They're doing nothing, the Liberals. And what are the Conservatives doing? Nothing. $92 billion to oil companies in assistance. Will they speak out against that? No, they're the oil lobby, Mr. Speaker. Housing, they won't even talk about it, the Liberals. What are they going to do? They're deciding to accuse municipalities, saying they don't build enough housing, Mr. Speaker. It's a party of slogans. It's a half dozen of one and six of more.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition a 1 minute.
The member is so angry. Very angry. Well, it's strange that he's so upset because his leader has just said that he will support the Liberals and keep them in power. I thought he would rise to celebrate all the wonderful things that the Liberals are doing by increasing inflation and driving up interest rates and the carbon tax that the Liberals want to drive up. Their leader also agrees that he wants to increase it as well. So the Bloc agrees with the Liberals on everything, except in terms of the capital of the country. That's it. That's the only point they disagree on with the Liberals. Fortunately, Quebecers will be able to vote for a logical party that will cut prices and give them bigger paychecks. That's what makes good sense.
The honourable member from Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada's not going to get out of the housing crisis that we're in without significant investments in social and affordable housing. And the Liberals simply have not been building enough of that. We saw today that even the recapitalization of a program to build affordable housing is being put up to 2025. But you never hear the leader of the Conservative Party talk about building new affordable and social housing. And in fact, Canada is still losing way more affordable units than we're building because when he was housing minister, that government decided to cancel the operating agreements that made rents affordable in co-op and other forms of nonprofit housing across the country. So I wonder, will he finally start talking about the need to build more social and affordable housing in Canada to help address the crisis?
The honourable leader of the opposition has
Mr.
just
Speaker,
over
I've
1
been
minute.
talking about almost nothing but making housing affordable for the last 3 years. When the NDP and the Liberals and the entire establishment were dismissing me, I told the country that we were headed for a housing crisis. And now everybody's playing catch up. But here's the problem for the NDP. The facts. When I was housing minister, you could rent the average one bedroom was $950. Now, under this NDP Liberal government, it's almost $2,000. When I was housing minister, you bought the average home with the average mortgage, it was $1,400 a month. Now it's $3,500 a month under the NDP and Liberals. When I was housing minister, the needed down payment for the average new home was $20,000. Now it's well over $50,000. The NDP has been in government now at least 2 years and supported the Prime Minister for long before that. Since they signed the coalition agreement, rent inflation has been its worst in Canadian history. We don't need more bureaucracy. We need my common sense plan to clear away the red tape and the gatekeepers, to build millions of new homes that Canadians can afford and allow them powerful paychecks to pay for it.
The honourable member from Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition tried to excuse himself and his caucus out of the way that they voted earlier today with respect to the Ukraine free trade agreement. I want to tell him that nobody believes him. Mr. Speaker, President Zelensky asked us to vote in favor of this. The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress asked us to vote in favor of this. As a matter of fact, the international trade lawyer for Larry Herman said the Conservative concern about reference to a carbon apartment pricing makes them look petty and hyper-partisan. It's nothing more than a red herring, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that MAGA Republican politics now lives and resides within the Conservative Party of Canada.
Sad, but true. Colleagues, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the hyperventilating member for Kingston only proves my point with those falsehoods. The Conservative Party initiated the original free trade agreement with Ukraine. We backed Ukraine against Crimea. We led the charge to kick Russia out of the G8, and now that's why we have the G7. This Prime Minister has betrayed Ukraine. He signed off on an export permit for a turbine to go to Russia so that Putin could pump gas and raise money to fund his war. He refused to sell natural gas from Canada, forcing Europeans to continue to fund that war. We want to defund Putin, Mr. Speaker. He embarrassed the president of Ukraine by allowing for a Nazi to be recognized on the floor of the House of Commons during the president's visit. And now the Prime Minister betrays Ukraine while the country has a knife at its throat. He uses it as an occasion to try and bolster his carbon tax by putting in it for the first time in the history of trade a carbon tax in a trade agreement. Mr. Speaker, Ukrainians don't need a carbon tax. Canadians don't need a carbon tax. And that's why my common sense plan will stand up to dictators like Putin, turn dollars to paychecks, dollars for dictators into paychecks for our people, and axe the tax for all.
I see that there are two members that would like to ask questions. We don't have a lot of time, so quick questions, please. And I hope the answers will be just as short. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I would really like to ask the question to the Leader of the Conservative Party. It's a question that is really important. We are facing a government that has forgotten what is common sense for all Canadians. The Conservative leader, can he tell us what is common sense and how a common sense government will help Canadian families? Unfortunately, I would just like to tell the Leader of the Official Opposition that he has 15 seconds. Common sense means getting rid of the carbon tax to reduce the cost of living for Canadians. Common sense means putting a cap on expenses and cutting waste to get the budget down and get inflation down. Common sense means cutting taxes so that it pays to work. That is what common sense is.